Welcome to Yizkor in the age of COVID. So many people have Yizkor on their minds. People have been asking questions about Yizkor, and rightfully so. Yizkor is a big deal, or so it has become in Jewish tradition. There are some people who come to Shul but once a year, or just several times a year. And Yizkor is the stimulant. This year, unfortunately, the shuls around the world will all be closed. And the question is what to do about Yizkor. So, on the surface, it seems very simple. Let me quote to you from a book called Gesher HaChaim. It's a contemporary Halakhic book. It was printed in the years following World War II, compiled in Yerushalayim, later amplified by this author's son. In chapter 31, which is about Hazkorat Neshamot, about the mentioning of souls, the Gesher HaChaim says the following: Ikir Hazkoras Haneshames, the primary essence of mentioning souls, V'gam Tfilas, and also the prayer of Kel Malei Rachamim, Hu B'tzibur. So Yizkor's primary emphasis is a communal thing. It should be done in Shul. However, he says, Aval gam hayochid, even a private individual, kishemispalel b'yom tov b'yechidus, when he or she prays on their own, in isolation, without a minyan and not in Shul, mazker neshamot, they too should mention souls. And he says the same is true also for Kel Malei Rachamim, that an individual can say it, and you don't need a minyan, which is an interesting question, because oftentimes people will go and visit the graves of parents or grandparents on the day of the recite, and not always will they get a minyan to accompany them. So he's very clear. He says, Kaddish you can say, but Kel Malei Rachamim, the formal memorial prayer, you can say. Where does he get this from? In the 19th century, there was a great Eastern European sage whose name was Rabbi Eliezer Deitch, and he wrote a responsa on Inyonei Smoches, things that are related to mourning and the aftermath of passing, memorializing loved ones. And in his 12th chapter, he discusses this subject. There was a villager, a farmer of sorts, living somewhere in the Carpathian Mountains, who was unable to make it to Shul for Yom Tov. And so he sent a letter requesting direction from this Rabbi Deitch. And in Shailas Utshuvis Dudo Yisoda, it's a very beautiful tshuva, very well developed. He explains that Yizkor is not a davar shebikdusha. It is not, and I'll quote and translate, but then explain. It is not, quote, a holy thing. And because it's not a holy thing, it doesn't require a minyan. It doesn't require a communal gathering of the public. Interestingly, there is a tshuva written of this, about the same time, a similar genre in the Shailas HaTshuvas called B'Tzel HaChochma, and there in the 4th volume, Siman Nun Gimel, in the 53rd chapter, he comes to the same conclusion. Okay, so what's pretty clear here is that Yizkor is not a davar shebekdusha, and that as such, we don't require a minyan, and we don't require a shul. So I have a simple question for all of you. And the simple question is, then why does the Gesher HaChaim begin by saying, Iker Haskaras Haneshames Hu B'tzibur? That the primary essence, the foundational practice of mentioning the souls of our loved ones is supposed to be done communally. Why should it be done communally? It's not a davar shebekdusha, it's not a holy thing, and therefore it doesn't require what we would call a proverbial minyan. And why do we make such a big deal out of going to Shul? And have we been duped? Have the rabbis created this business of going to Shul because They wanted to keep us in Shul. And now when they can't have us in Shul, the rabbis are saying, well, it doesn't really need to be done in Shul. You can do it at home too. What does that mean for next year? What does it mean for the future of Shuls and Yizkor? These are all important questions which I hope to be able to give you a significant amount of food for thought for. I will give you the sources. I will tell you everything as I was able to discover and piece it together, and you can decide for yourself. I'll give you my conclusion. You're welcome to come to your own. Let's first talk about a davar shebekdusha. So the Dudai Sada's premise, as well as the B'tziel HaChochma, is that Yizkor is not a davar shebekdusha. What are we talking about? What is a holy thing? A davar shebekdusha. So there's a Mishnah, and it's found in Masechet Megillah. In the Babylonian Talmud, it's found on the 23rd page, Daf Chav Gimel Amud Beis. And there, the Mishnah talks about the concept of davar shebekdusha, holy things. And the Mishnah's statement is that davar shebekdusha ein oimrim b'pachas me'asara. A thing of holiness cannot be invoked or evoked unless there is a minyan present. That's the quorum that we speak of for prayer. As a rule, 10 males, Jewish males, who are over the age of 13, bar mitzvah. How do we know this? Where does it say in the Bible? Where in the Torah does it say anything about davar shebekdusha? In fact, where does it speak about a minyan? Everybody knows about a minyan. Really? Did Avraham Avinu daven with a minyan? He was the only Jew. Did Yitzchak daven with a minyan? They didn't even have a mezuzah. He had only his father. At best, he could have davened in pairs. Yaakov? Well, eventually Yaakov gets his own minyan, but that takes some time. Where does minyan come from? Where does this notion of davar shebekdusha come from? So it says in the book of Leviticus, and this is found in the 22nd chapter, the 32nd verse, just before we speak about Yomim Tovim, about the festivals. The Torah says, V'nikdashti, I will be hallowed. That's the verb of the word kedusha. Kadosh is a noun. Kedusha is a noun. So v'nikdashti, I will be hallowed. I will be made holy. B'toch b'nei Yisrael, in the midst of the children of Israel. And here the Gemara says we learn what is called a Gezeras Shava. It's one of the 13 principles through which we are able to perform exegesis, biblical exegesis, and be able to derive from the Torah itself the deeper ideas and ideals, the laws, and the governing principles. So we learn from a Gezeras Shava, from a juxtaposition, that the Torah says, V'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael. I will be hallowed, I will be, so to speak, made holy, says God, b'toch, amidst the Jewish people. V'ne'emar, and it is written in the next book of the Torah, and here we go to the book of Numbers, we call it Bamidbar. In the 16th chapter, verse 21, it says, Hibodlu mitoch ha'eda hazot. Here we have Moshe Rabbeinu. And Moshe Rabbeinu is speaking to a rebellious group of Jewish leadership. They're led by Korach, who is the rebellious Jew in chief. And he challenges the leadership of Moshe Rabbeinu and the priesthood of Aaron, the high priest Aaron HaKohen. And Moshe Rabbeinu says to the rest of the Jewish people, separate yourselves from this evil congregation, from this bad group of people. Now, how many is a congregation in Edom? So we say, the first thing we know is, it says mitoch and mitoch. It says v'nikdashti. God says, I can be hallowed, b'toch, amongst the Jewish people. And Moshe Rabbeinu says that he bodlu mitoch ha'eda hazot. So now I know that there's some kind of relationship or connection between the concept of v'nikdashti, which is a sacred imperative for us to hallow the name of God, and the idea of a bad congregation. How many is an Eda, though? How many do you need? 2's company? 3's a crowd? What's a congregation? So the Gemara goes on to tell us that an Eidah can never be less than 10. And where do we know this from? From another group of rebellious Jews. Not Korach, but just before Korach's rebellion, we have the story of the scouts that were sent by Moshe Rabbeinu, in Hebrew called Meraglim. And Moshe Rabbeinu cries out and he said, Ad matai le'eda hara hazot. How much longer will we have to deal with this evil congregation? Now, there were 12 scouts. If it's an evil congregation, we know that Joshua and Caleb, Yoshua and Caleb, were not amongst the evil people. What's left, 12 minus 2, is 10. So 10 ultimately becomes an Eidah. So if you see how we kind of string together this halacha, we analyze the Torah very carefully. We look at the words the Torah uses, and there is a gezeirat shava within a gezeirat shava, a juxtaposition to a juxtaposition. It says here toch, and it says toch by Korach, and it says Eidah by Korach, and it says Eidah with the Meraglim are 10. From here we can work now extrapolating backwards. If the Meraglim were called an Eidah, a congregation, when they only had 10, if Korach was called an Eidah, we know now there must have been at least 10 people that were with him, much more than that, but the minimum would be 10 people, and from this we can go back to the betoch of the Nikdashti. Now, there are others who learned this from a different Gezerah Shava, and they say, here it says V'nikdashti Bnei Yisrael, and there's another time where it says the word betoch, much, much earlier, centuries earlier. And this is when the brothers of Yosef to the land of Egypt to procure provisions for the family back home in Canaan, but they're also coming to look for their lost brother. And it says Lishbar, they come, Vayavo Bnei Yisrael, the children, the sons of Israel, here it's quite literal, come to procure provisions, betoch haboyim, they are amongst the coming. How many are they? Yaakov Avinu, father Jacob, has 12 sons, 12 tribes. One's name is Yosef. He's in Egypt. He's the viceroy. Nobody knows who he is yet, at least not on the Jewish side. Binyamin was left home. How many Shvatim then were there then? 10. So we have betoch, and so we have a kind of backwards Gezerah Shava, and once again, we have this notion of a minyan. So v'nikdashti means creating holiness, and if you want to manufacture holiness, you need a crowd, you need a quorum of a congregation, what we call in the vernacular a minyan. Now here's the thing. Is this biblical? Is it actually biblical? It can't really be biblical, says Rabbeinu Nissen the Ran, one of the very prominent Rishonim in his commentary on Masechet Megillah. It can't actually be biblical because we're talking about davening. And although the notion of davening, according to many Rishonim, chiefly the Rambam, is a biblical obligation to pray, but that could just mean, dear God, please take care of me today. But the notion of davening, as we have it, the liturgy of prayer, which was only formulated in its present syntax during the Second Temple era, is certainly rabbinic. It's not biblical per se. Maimonides, who says clearly that davening is a biblical mitzvah, also in the book of mitzvahs identifies the davening as we do it today, including the times of davening and the amount of times we have to daven. And he says this is rabbinic. So the Ran says this cannot be a biblical concept, it's an asmachta. The word asmachta is a Talmudic term for to simplify it, a Hebraic word meaning support. Somech noflim, says King David in the book of Psalms. God who supports those who are collapsing. This buttresses a Torah idea. So we seek support for our rabbinic injunctions within the Torah itself. And because, as the Gemara in Masechet Tanit on page 9 tells us, lekamidi, there is nothing, but nothing in Judaism. The leiramizi ba'iraisa, which is not already alluded to, hinted at in the syntax, in the scripture, the words of the Torah itself. So therefore, there's going to be various forms of asmachta in which we lean on the Torah to be able to demonstrate the veracity of a particular observance within Judaism. Here, the concept of davar shebekdusha. And why is this all? Why is this? Why do we need a minyan for a davar shebekdusha? Says Rabbeinu Hai Goen, and there are other Geonim and Rishonim who are also subscribed to this idea, but Rabbeinu Hai is chief amongst those who advance this explanation, that this has to do with the Shechina. And we know that there is a statement that is made by our sages in various forms, Akol be'asara shchinto sharye. Whenever you have a minyan, you have God's presence. And so when you have God's presence, that is to say that every neshama brings a small portion, a small piece of God's presence, but without 9 others, you don't have the electromagnet completed. The spiritual electromagnet only goes live when you have 10 souls invested in bodies together in the same place. And that's why all these Zoom minyanim of the COVID age are cute, maybe inspirational, but actually have no meaning. You cannot say a davar shebekdusha. You cannot use the terminology, the syntax of Kaddish and Baruch and the repetition of Shmon Esrei if you have 100,000 people on Zoom, because they need to be in the same physical location. So when you have souls tethered to bodies in the same location, then you have created a repository of the divine presence, the Shekhinah. And Rabbeinu Hai says that's the reason that a davar shebekdusha, in order for us to be empowered to manufacture or create holiness in real time, we need to be able to work together or off each other. And only when we united together, only when we come together in this fashion, do we complete the electromagnet and then go live. Now, it's of course telling and compelling when we think about the idea that 9 super tzaddikim do not comprise a minyan. But 10 very wicked Jews do. Because this is not about level of accomplishment or achievement in the realm of the spiritual. This is about the matter of fact. The matter of fact is that every one of us has a beautiful, magnificent soul, a piece of God Himself. And that beautiful, magnificent, amazing neshama has within it the properties that when conjoined together with others is able to activate what we call the presence. We're able to connect to the iCloud, if you will. And Hashem's reality, the reality of the Shekhinah, becomes our reality in our world. So what is a davar shebekdusha? A davar shebekdusha is Kaddish. You cannot say Kaddish without a minyan. Even though you'd like to, even though it feels good, it still doesn't work. It's not the right thing. The essence of Kaddish is to publicly declare the holiness of God. And that public declaration necessarily requires a minyan. Baruch Hu, which is a prayer formula that is inserted at various critical components of the evening service and the morning service, that's called a davar shebekdusha. You can't do it without a minyan. Chazaras Hashatz, the repetition of the Amidah, that's a davar shebekdusha. And because that's a davar shebekdusha, unless you have a minyan present, you can't do it. Now, there are other parts of Jewish rite and ritual which necessarily require a minyan, but they're not called davar shebekdusha. They're not called a thing of holiness. And you'll be surprised to discover that the reading of the Torah is not called a davar shebekdusha. It is not a manufacturing per se of holiness. It's a very important thing, a beautiful thing. You can't do it without a minyan, but it's not a davar shebekdusha. The Haftorah, the blessings on and subsequent reading of the codicil to the Torah reading, the weekly Torah reading, which is selected from the tapestry of the prophecies of times that followed the actual Chumash, very important. It's performed on Shabbat, performed on holidays, performed on public fast days, but you can't do it without a minyan. But it's not a davar shebekdusha. So why do you need a minyan? That's a really good question. According to the Mishnah, it's because these were takanat chachamim. These were injunctions of the sages. And the sages' injunction was not only that we should read the Torah, but that when we read the Torah, there should be a minyan present. Now, the reading of the Torah on Shabbat morning and Monday and Thursday is probably one of the oldest rabbinic injunctions. It is 3,300 years old or older. It was instituted during the lifetime of Moshe Rabbeinu, of Moses. We have an asmachta. We have a verse that speaks about the Jewish people going for 3 days without water, and we say, Ein mayim el Torah, there is no water but Torah, and so you can't go by, a Jew shouldn't go by 3 days without hearing the reading of the Torah in a public fashion. At any rate, the Rambam says Moshe Rabbeinu was the one who brought this into being. Our sages do not indicate this. They seem to say that it was Chachamim B'doro Shel Moshe. The Kesef Mishnah answers that the Rambam was certain that it would be impossible to conceive of the sages during the time of Moshe who would have done something without the tutelage or instruction from Moshe. So at any rate, it goes back to Moshe, the first rabbi, the first rabbis. And they instituted that this should only be performed in a public fashion. Another thing which is not called a davar shebekedusha, it's not a holy thing, and we're able to use these words without a minyan, is the concept of birchat kohanim. Truth be told, you don't even have to be a Kohen to use those words to bless others. In fact, it is common in many Jewish homes to bless the children on Friday night. What words do they use? Birchat Kohanim, whether you're a Kohen, Levi, or Israel. And the same is true in virtually all communities. We bless our children at the onset of Yom Kippur. What words do we use? Yevorechecha Yaris of Birchat Kohanim. At a wedding, the father of the bride and then the father of the groom will bless the kala. And what will he utter? Birchat Kohanim. So clearly it's not a davar shebekedusha. It doesn't have to be done in the presence of a minyan. And you don't have to be a Kohen to say these words. You're reading or repeating words from the Torah. But the formality of Nasiat Kapayim, which is actually a biblical mitzvah that the Kohanim bless us on a daily basis. Although the first time Aaron the high priest performed this, it was an intuitive expression in which he gushed forward on the day that the Shekhinah was about to arrive for the Jewish people, on that 8th holy and exalted day after 7 days of preparing for the Shekhinah to arrive. And then on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, Aaron HaKohen, the high priest, comes down from the Mizbeach and he gushes forward in blessing. But that wasn't an official, formal Nasiat Kapayim, because the commandment for Nasiat Kapayim only comes later on. So Nasiat Kapayim, which means the blessing of the Kohanim, can only be performed not because it's a davar shebekedusha. It isn't. It isn't. I just proved to you it isn't. Because anybody can mouth those words meaningfully. So why do we have to have it done in that fashion? Well, because that's how the rabbis ordained it to be. And if you'll ask the question, what do you mean? It's a rabbinic. It's a rabbinic? It's biblical. Of course it's biblical, said the Ran. However, the rabbis ordained that this biblical mitzvah should only be performed in the presence of a congregation or a public. And so it's done in the idea of a minyan. We learn it from the concept of v'nikdashti b'tov b'nei Yisrael, but it's not per se part of the biblical mitzvah. And furthermore, it's not a davar shebekedusha. Now, all of this is a bit of a tangent, and I apologize for that, but I want you to understand exactly what we're talking about here. I don't believe in keeping the masses in the dark. You, my dear friends, need to have a keen understanding of what Yizkor is and what we'll be doing this year. So, what you must know at this point is, can you mouth the words of Yizkor? Certainly. It's not a davar shebekedusha. A thing of holiness requires a minyan for its verbalization. Verbalization of those words is not included in davar shebekedusha. You could say the formal words of Yizkor and Kel Malei Rachamim without a minyan present. Well, if you can say it without a minyan present, why do we go to Shul for Yizkor? Why isn't it a private thing? Has the bubble burst? Now that the rabbis told you the truth that you can say Yizkor this year without a minyan, are you done going to Shul for Yizkor? Well, keep watching. It's not that simple at all. So this is the way I wanted to begin. I want to reiterate, without any question whatsoever, one may in fact recite the words of Yizkor. As we read earlier, the Gesher HaChaim clearly says, though, Ikar Azkaras Neshamas is B'tzibur, and so in order to understand this, we must go on a journey together. And in this journey, we will go back to the beginning. Whoever came up with this idea? Why do we mention Shamot? Is it related to a particular time? Is it related to a synagogue gathering or convocation? And how does that play itself out in our day and age? So the earliest source that I was able to find for the concept of Yizkor takes us back to the 10th century. According to most historians, Torah historians, the Medrash Tanchuma, which is eponymously named for Rebbe Tanchuma, one of the great sages of the land of Israel, is a compilation of the Midrashay Eretz Yisrael. Just like we have a Talmud Yerushalmi, a Jerusalem Talmud, which is the Talmud as it was compiled in the land of Israel. A smaller amount of sages lived in Israel, but they were considered more exalted. We typically will follow the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, which is much more exhaustive. And it was compiled at a later time, slightly later. So they saw the rulings of the earlier Talmud, and yet they formulated their rulings according to their understanding of halacha. This is what we usually follow. So midrashically speaking, Medrash Rabbah is the midrashim of the sages that was compiled later. At least Medrash Rabbah is actually the genre of the Mishnah, but later midrashim are the midrashim of Bavel. Medrash Tanchuma is the later midrashic compilation, the post-Talmudic compilation of the midrashim that we had in the land of Israel. If you could find comparative things in Medrash Tanchuma, in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, and even in the Sheiltis, which is written in the time of the Gaonim. So this is a quote from the Medrash Tanchuma, going back now to the 10th century, at which time it's formally compiled, on Parshat Ha'azinu, which is the second to the last parsha of the entire Torah, found in the 32nd chapter of the book of Deuteronomy. And I will quote to you. Lakach regilin lahazkir hamesim b'Shabbat. This is why we mention souls, the names of our dear departed ones, on Shabbat. On Shabbat, says the Medrash Tanchuma. Shalo yoshuvu legehinnom, so that they will not be returned to purgatory. So purgatory is much misunderstood. In many circles it's been perverted or bastardized beyond recognition. The essence of purgatory is not that God seeks vengeance. God is not hateful. God is not vindictive. God is Avinu Av HaRachama. He is all-loving. Well, if God's all-loving, why is there purgatory? And the answer simply is that in order for souls who have absorbed an enormous volume of toxins during the course of their journey here in a terrestrial sense, in order for the soul to be cleansed, because the soul is very much impacted by the negativity that people were involved with, thoughts ruminated upon, words spoken, actions taken, there's a cleansing process. One of the metaphors for the cleansing process is extreme heat. Think of sterilization. Think of what we would do to cleanse something if it had absorbed non-kosher material. It's famous halachas of Pesach, the laws of Hagala. We can either sterilize it with boiling hot water, or if it's al ha'esh, as they say, barbecue material, literally on the fire, then only fire, which means making it red hot, would enable us to rid the object of the foreign toxic substance. So that's where the metaphors of the fires of hell, if you will, came from. But there is this notion that souls have to endure a difficult, unsettling, and painful reality in order to be cleansed so that they might merit to bask in God's glory. Shekein isa b'teiras koyanim. And I have to tell you that many of the later authorities who quote this Medrash Tanchuma use the terminology sifri. So there's a Medrash Halacha. It's kind of an oral teaching that follows the actual books of the Torah. On the book of Bereshit and Shmot, it's known as Mechilta. On the book of Leviticus, Vayikra, it's called Safra, which is also sometimes referred to as Torat Kohanim, because Leviticus, well, it's Leviticus. It's about Kohanim. And then there is the Medrash Halacha on the books of Bamidbar and Dvarim, Numbers and Deuteronomy, and that is called Sifri. So I'm not sure why the Medrash Tanchuma refers to the Medrash Halacha of Bamidbar and Dvarim as Torah Kohanim. It may be a printing mistake, I don't know, or maybe that's actually how it was referred to. We call it the Sifri, and it's later on quoted as the Sifri. And the Sifri has a very interesting teaching. The Medrash Halacha has the interesting teaching on the 21st chapter of the book of Deuteronomy, which speaks about a mitzvah, a divine commandment, which is called Egla Arufa. The essence of this divine commandment is when there is an unsolved murder. We have a corpse, we have a victim, we don't have a perpetrator. So there's this business of the elders of the closest settlement, the closest town in Israel, having to come either to a gushing stream of water or to an area that has never been planted, depending if you follow the school of thought advanced by Maimonides or Rashi. It's called a nachal, which could mean a river or a stream, a gushing stream in a literal way, or sometimes it can mean a gorge. At any rate, a cow is beheaded, and the elders have to wash their hands. And they wash their hands right over the blood of this young calf. And in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 21, verse 7, Devarim Chafalef, Kapitel Chafalef, Pasuk Zayin, it says, V'anu v'yamru, the sages, the elders will say, Yodeinu loi shafchu, our hands have not spilled es hadam hazeh, this blood. Ve'eineinu loi ra'u, our eyes didn't see. We are blameless, we are guiltless, we do not have responsibility. There's nothing more we could have done to have protected this victim of a homicide. And yet, despite the fact that they make this declaration of innocence, in verse 8, they go on to beseech heaven. Kaper la'amcha Yisrael. Atone for your nation Israel, asher padita, whom you have redeemed. Asher padita Hashem. There's much to be said on this. I'm just going to tell you that the Baal HaTurim, in his commentary on the Chumash, says, Mikan shekol Yisrael arevim zelazeh. From here we can see that all of the Jewish people have a mixed lot. None of us is independent from one another. What happens to one of us necessarily will impact all of us. Our destinies are shared. Sometimes it's not a good thing. Like a circumstance, a situation where a homicide was committed. We have to ask Hashem to forgive us. It doesn't say forgive the people from this city. It says kaper, forgive Amcha Yisrael, your entire nation. You say entire nation. There's people living hundreds of thousands of kilometers away. Why would they need atonement? My dear brothers and sisters, if something happens to a Yid somewhere, ultimately, we are responsible. We are our brother's keeper. We are responsible for each other. But going back to the Medrash Tanchuma says, quoting the Sifri or the Teres Kohanim, it says, Kaper la'amcha Yisrael, and then it says, Asher padita. Forgive your nation Israel, whom you have redeemed. Which ostensibly means redeemed from Egypt. I mean, don't we know who was redeemed from Egypt? It's true, when God introduces himself to us, he says, hey everybody, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God, Asher Hotzetzicha Me'eretz Mitzrayim, who took you out of Egypt. But it has been mentioned time and again that the people of Israel are the people who were taken out of Egypt, and in fact that serves as the birth of our nation. But here we emphasize the idea of La'amcha Yisrael Asher Padita. So our sages tell us something fascinating. Kaper la'amcha Yisrael Elo HaChayim. Forgive your nation Israel. These are those who find themselves terrestrially alive at that particular time. Asher Padita. That you had redeemed. Elo HaMeitim. This refers to the Jewish people who once lived. Let's think about this for a moment. a homicide was committed. Tragically, a life was snuffed out. Nobody knows how this happened, but it happened on our watch. It happened in our territory. The elders must come together and wash their hands of this sin. They must say, we don't know how this happened. And then, after declaring innocence, they're beseeching or petitioning heaven for kapara, for atonement. And according to our sages, they're asking La'amcha Yisrael, for the Jewish people who are alive, Asher Podita, they're asking for atonement for the Jewish people who once lived. Says the Medrash Tanchuma. From this we can see that kapara, from this we can see that atonement is relevant not only during our terrestrial lifetimes, but even after our terrestrial lifetimes. Lakach. Therefore, this is the reason this is why we mention the names of our dearly departed on Yom Kippur. And that's why we commit to giving tzedakah on their behalf. For we learned in the Teres Kainim, you might think from the time in which they have passed on, tzedakah given by their descendants or in their merit will have no efficacy. This is actually Teres Kainim. This is the Sifra. This is on Parshas Acharimot, which talks about Yom Kippur and the fact that it's called Yom Kippurim. And there are multiple commentaries who note that it doesn't say Yom Kippur but Kippurim, which is plural. And one of the answers that is offered, it's Kippurim. It's a day of atonement for those who are alive and a day of atonement for those who have passed on. Talmud Lomar Asher Padita. It's not just about atonement for those who are alive. Asher Padita, for those who you redeemed, which ostensibly refers to the Jewish people who left the land of Mitzrayim, who lived 33 centuries ago. They too require atonement, and obviously everybody ever since. Mikan, from here the Medrash Tanchuma finishes off. Kishe poskin tzedakah b'shvilam, when tzedakah, freely translated as charity, but really righteous giving, is done in their merit, for their behalf, on their behalf, motzi'in u'ma'alin otam, then it is able to remove, to elevate them, to extricate them from their circumstance, kechetz min hakeshet, like an arrow that is shot from the bow. A tremendous surge, a tremendous force, literally a bow shot. So it's a leap forward, and it can change the reality of these neshamot. So my friends, we're talking about the 10th century. We're talking about midrashic material, which ultimately goes back to the genre of the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is talking to us about, really, three things. This Medrash, number one, emphasizes the notion of mentioning souls on Shabbat. It proves the efficacy of mentioning souls because of the Medrash on the Egla Arufa, La'amcha Yisrael Asher Pradita. And then strangely, it starts off with talking about Shabbat and the mentioning of the Shamot. However, once it actually introduces you to the Midrashic teaching on Egla Arufa, takes you in a different direction and says, this is why we mention the Shamot on Yom Kippur. Who's talking about Yom Kippur? We talked about Shabbat before. And now we get introduced to a new idea. V'livsek aleim tzedakah. It's not just about mentioning names. It's not just about mentioning words. It's about giving tzedakah on their behalf. So giving tzedakah is very meaningful. That's how the Medrash finishes off. Mikan kisha poiskin tzedakah. It doesn't say kisha mazkirim nishmaisem. It doesn't say when you mention that neshama. It says from here we can see that when you give tzedakah in their merit, on their behalf, maitzin umailin, you take them out, you elevate them. Like an arrow shot from the bow, like a cannonball shot out of the barrel. And that's the first mention of Yizkor. It's foundational. It's foundational because it's Medrash Tanchuma. But the interesting thing is, there's no mention of Yom Tov. There's a mention only of Shabbat. There's a mention of Yom Kippur. And there's an emphasis placed primarily not on a prayer, and not on the verbalization of names, but rather the commitment of giving tzedakah. The next time anything Yizkor-like shows up in actual print is several centuries later. A very important compilation of customs, synagogue etiquette, and laws of how we observe Jewish ritual round the year, which is called Shibbolei Halakhic. It was written very interestingly by a great 14th century sage whose name was Tzidkiah, the son of Avraham Harofeh. He was a medical doctor, like Maimonides, like Rashba, like many great sages were also doctors, but we don't know of him as a great sage, teacher, rabbinic leader, or judge. We know of him as a doctor. And this very meticulous scientist was a tremendous, absolutely astounding Torah scholar who created this written documentation of Jewish ritual around the year. The Shibbolei Halakhic, in the 81st chapter, cites the following custom. And I quote, Acharei kriyat hahaftorah, after the reading of the additional reading, not the Torah reading, but the Haftorah, nohagu lahazkir neshamot. It is customary to mention neshamot. Rabbeinu Tzidkiah tells us that his brother Binyamin wrote that the reason we do this on Shabbat, once again, you see the connection. Medrash Tanchuma, 4.5 centuries later, he's alluding to Shabbat. That Binyamin, the brother of Tzidkiah, author of Shibbolei Halakhic, says, the reason we do this on Shabbat, hu yom menucha. It is a day of rest, or a day of respite. And he says, this is dugma la'atid lavo. This is in the image, paradigmatic of how life will be in the future that is yet to come. That's after Mashiach is. And he says, not only is Shabbat something that alludes or evokes a future reality of total rest and respite from any kind of agony or anxiety, but it's also Yom Shegam Hameitim Nochim. It's also a day that the dead rest. And we say rest in peace. We never say that, actually. That's a non-Jewish thing. We say Tanseba. We don't want our dead to rest. We want them to be bound to the bond of life. We want them to be righteous. We pray for them that they will go mechayel el chayel. They will go from strength to strength. But possibly because of imperfections and mistakes during their time here, they may have impediments or obstacles. And that could be trying or difficult. 6 days a week. Not on Shabbat. Shabbat is respite. Shagam Hameitim, wrote the brother of the Shibbolei Halakhic, who quotes him, also the deceased, Nochimbo, are also at rest. Ve'einon dindonim, and they do not have to answer for things they did, and as such, Roi lahazkiran limnucha, we should mention them in a syntax of respite, of peace, of tranquility, o livracha, in a framework of benison, of blessing, ulitpalel aleim, and we should pray on their behalf. So we have this mention of Yizkor. The Medrash Tanchuma did not tell us anything about why this is connected to Shabbat. It kind of alluded to the notion that they're out of Gehenim. Shelo yashuvu leGehenim. Here the Shibbolei Halakhic elaborates on this idea, quoting his brother, and he says it's Yom Menucha. And just like the Yom Menucha, the respite, the tranquility, the peace, the serenity of Shabbat also is something that evokes a future reality, similarly, it also is something that's going on now. In other words, Shabbat can be experienced on many different levels. There's the Shabbat as you and I experience it here on planet Earth. There's the Shabbat as Neshamot experience it in their world. There's the Shabbat as it will be experienced in Yom Shekulu Shabbat, when Mashiach comes, hopefully very, very soon in our time, Amen. So that's the reason we should pray for them. Now in the Shibbolei Halakhic, there is no mention of Yom Kippur. There is nothing discussed about any kind of kapara, really. It's just that it's an appropriate time to pray because it's Shabbat. So from both of these very early sources, it seems pretty clear that we would do well to mention a Shemot and Shabbat. Why? because of we're in Shul together? No mention of Shul. It says you do it after the Haftorah. That's just when it's done in Shul. But it says it's an appropriate time to do it. It's an appropriate time to pray. At this point, it seems entirely within the realm of something that can certainly be done privately. It doesn't seem to be a davar shebekdusha. It seems, in fact, to be untethered to the synagogue altogether, except that the Shibbolei Halakhic mentions that it's done achrei Kriyat Haftorah. Now, the Shibbolei Halakhic was also living in the time of the Tosafos, and it is said that there were traditions from Rashi's Beis HaMedrash that also end up in his writings. Around the same time, a similar compilation was put together by a disciple, a direct disciple of Rashi, whose name was Rabbi Simcha Vitri. And he called his compilation Machzor Vitri. A Machzor, like the name we use for a high holiday prayer book, is an order. And this is the order of the year. He goes through the year, the rituals of the year. He goes through daily rituals, he talks about the Shabbat, and then he talks about the festivals. The Machzor Vitri, in the end of his writings on the three festivals, which is Shavuot is the last one he talks about, he says this. He says that on the second day of Yom Tov, after the Haftorah, he says, Uposkim tzedakah berabim al hachayim levadam. The Machzor Vitri says, on the second day of Yom Tov, we make a point, he's talking about the second day of Shavuot, but he says we make a point of publicizing, of announcing people's tzedakah commitments. The way I've seen the Machzor Vitri explained, essentially, what we find here is the custom that in the Middle Ages, synagogues would not really have fundraisers, not events or people whose job it was to fundraise, but there were expenses. So on the last day of Yom Tov, people would make commitments. This is similar to the more modern custom of selling the mitzvot for the year on Shabbat Bereshit. But in the Middle Ages, it seems, that on the last day of Yom Tov, people would make their commitments. So on the last day of Pesach, people would come to Shul and they would make a public appeal. And people would make commitments. On the last day of Shavuot, there would be an appeal made and people would make their commitments. And that's how they proverbially kept the lights on. You know, oil to fuel the lamps. There were people who kept the Shul going, clean, warm. There was the rabbinic leadership. People had to be paid. So the public appeal was always made on the last day of Yom Tov. And that's when people give only for the living, says the Machzor Vitri. Why is this? Why the last day of Yom Tov? Says the Machzor Vitri, mipnei, because karu hayim ishke matnas yodai. Because the Torah reading on the last day of Yom Tov is called Kol HaBechor Aser Ta'aser. It's about tzedakah. Specifically about a gift to Hashem in his Beit HaMikdash, bringing offerings and supporting the Beit HaMikdash. The Mikdash Mi'at, the minor Beit HaMikdash, that's the Beit HaKnesset, that's the Shul. So this is a perfect time. Everybody just heard about it in the Torah. You just read publicly. You read the words Ish Kematnas Yodoi. That every single one of us has a sacred duty to support the house of Hashem, to enable the Shekhinah to reside amongst us. How much should you give? Kematnas Yodoi. As much as you're able. Everybody gives in accordance with their ability. And then the Machzor Vitri adds something very interesting. V'chein, it is also, he says, a minhag b'chol yom achron shel regalim, on the last days of the Yom Tov, shekorin parsha zu, that we read this parsha, lifsok tzedakah al hachayim levadam. It is indeed, he says, our custom only to do this in honor of the living. You can honor your father, your mother, your sister, your brother, your children, your mother-in-law, your father-in-law, whoever you want to honor. You honor your friends. Maybe somebody did a favor for you. Now you will publicly honor him and say that such and such, who is kind to me, in his honor, I will do the following. Make the following commitment. V'lo al hametim, We should not mention the dead, says Machzor Vitri. Very different what the Shibbolei HaLeket said, but the Shibbolei HaLeket never mentioned Yom Tov. He only talked about Shabbat. Why is that, he says? It almost seems like the Machzor Vitri is saying, yeah, people do this on Shabbat, but not on Yom Tov. Shelo lehitzta'er aleihem, because when people start to bring to mind the memories of those they lost, it often causes a terrible amount of inner pain. And we don't want people to be sad or in pain on Yom Tov. Why not? Why not? Because Deuteronomy 16:15 says, V'hayita ach sameach. On Yom Tov, it's a time to be joyous. Now, it's true that pasuk is referring to Sukkot. However, the oral tradition extrapolates that the notion of joy applies to all three festivals. Then the Machzor Vitri adds, however, minhag ba'eretz Ashkenaz, it is a minhag, is the custom. In the lands of the Germanic provinces, the Alsace-Lorraine provinces, modern-day France and Germany and everything in between, she'ein poskim tzedakah al hametim, that we do not make commitments to honor the dead, begimel regalim, ela b'yom haKippurim bilvad, only on Yom Kippur. So the Machzor Vitri is very clear. He doesn't speak even about mentioning their names per se. The emphasis here is about giving tzedakah. The Machzor Vitri tells us that he rejected the notion of doing this on Yom Tov. Yom Tov was a time to give tzedakah in honor of the living, not in honor of the dead, because that's not a Yom Tov thing to do. And he says that is the minhag in Alsace-Lorraine. We do not. In Ashkenaz, he says, we do not mention the neshamot on Yom Tov, only on Yom Kippur. Now, the words of the Machzor Vitri fit really beautifully and perfectly with everything we just learned from the Medrash Tanchuma. The Medrash Tanchuma talked to us about Shabbat. He's not rejecting the concept of Shabbat. He's rejecting the idea of Yom Tov. He doesn't say he can't do this on Shabbat. He says it's on Yom Tov. It says Vayitach Somer. And he speaks specifically about Yom Kippur. Why? Because there's an emphasis on kapara. There's an emphasis on the concept of Kaper La'amcha Yisrael. And we have the words of our sages that tell us that kapara, that Yom Kippurim, is efficacious for the living and for the dead. He says that's the way you're supposed to do the concept of Yizkor. It's a Yom Kippur thing. It's connected to the idea of kapara. And it's very clear that the emphasis here is on giving tzedakah. He says giving of tzedakah is a very important thing. We should make commitments on Yom Tov. Actually, that's how it was. For whatever reason, this faded away. But this is how it used to be in the Middle Ages. The primary income that enabled the synagogues to continue to function in a healthy way, in a fiduciary sense, was based on the commitment made on the last day of Yom Tov. He says it should only be for the living. It shouldn't be for the dead. You give tzedakah and to honor the memories of those who have passed on Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur, which, as I said, fits perfectly with the concept of what that's articulated in the Parsha, in the Medrash Tanchuma, and dovetails very beautifully with the words of the Shibbolei HaLeket. Although the Shibbolei HaLeket speaks specifically about mentioning the Shamot on Shabbat, and he does not speak about the Yom Tov altogether. So what we really have at this point is a midrashic foundation, and we have two early Rishonim, Shibbolei HaLeket and Machzor Vitri, who, in complementary ways, both reflect the Medrash Tanchuma in different dimensions. The Shibbolei HaLeket reflecting the idea that is articulated about mentioning those who have passed on Shabbat, emphasis on Shabbat, and the Machzor Vitri, who emphasizes the idea of giving tzedakah, which is the second half of the Medrash Tanchuma, and he speaks about Yom Kippur, about Kapara. So far, we have a Yizkor once a year on Yom Kippur, and it seems to have nothing to do with a synagogue. It seems to have nothing to do with a minyan. It seems to have nothing to do with congregation or communal activity. Please don't stop watching. The plot shall thicken. So now, as we move from the Shibbolei HaLeket, the Machzor Vitri, and from the words that were articulated by the Medrash Tanchuma, let's come a little bit closer into the idea of the Shulchan Aruch, What do we do in today's day and age? So now moving into the 16th century, it is telling, possibly compelling, to note that Rambam Maimonides does not mention anything about Yizkor. The Rif, the Alphas, which is a compilation of halachot along the framework of the Talmud, mentions nothing about Yizkor. The Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, mentions nothing about Yizkor. These are the three primary foundational sources of halacha. Rabbeinu Yosef Karo wrote his work, his Shulchan Aruch, first his Tur, and then his Shulchan Aruch, the Rabbeinu Yaakov Balaturim wrote the halachot in the Tur, which are later amplified on and worked on by the Shulchan Aruch and developed into the Shulchan Aruch by Rabbi Yosef Karo, is based on these three halachic sources. Now there is one halachic source, and I try as I might, I spent hours looking for this, I could not find it. Apparently, the Mordechai ben Hillel Ashkenazi, who is I believe, a 15th century sage, a halachist who wrote in kind of along the flow of the Talmud as well, not as prominent as Alphas, as the Rif, or as the Rosh, but apparently the Mordechai does mention this. So I'm just putting it out there. I couldn't find it. I looked for it. Apparently the Mordechai does. We have a Shabole Haleket, we have Rabbeinu Simcha Vitri, early Rishonim, the genre of Rashi and the Tosafos. In the Tur, rules of Shabbat, Orach Chaim, the Tur is 4 sections of halacha. The part of halacha, the first section, which is called daily life, laws of Shabbat, chapter 284, Simin Reish Pei Dalad in Hilchas Shabbos. The Tur mentions nothing about Yizkor. Nothing whatsoever. However, the Bet Yosef, the 16th century sage who later writes the Shulchan Aruch, he quotes the Shibboleh Haleket with slight variations that I just quoted to you directly. And then he says, V'chein mevorchim al ha'oskim b'tzorchei tzibur. We also bless not only those on Shabbat who have passed on, but we also bless those who are involved in communal matters. In tzedakah, in gemilas chasadim, those who are giving, are generous, are beneficent, those involved in the dispensing of acts of kindness, those who ensure that the lights remain on in Shul, provide the fuel, the ner lamoir. And he adds the following then. So first of all, the Bet Yosef adds something which we didn't hear about before, and this is actually what we do every single Shabbat. In the secondary Yukum Purkan, where we ask Hashem, all of those who are involved in communal work, Hashem, Almighty God, should repay them. He should give them grand recompense. So we actually do that, and interestingly, that second part of the Yukum Purkan is not recited unless we are in Shul with a minyan. At any rate, the Bet Yosef goes on to say, V'hachai yiten el libo, the living should take to heart. Kama godol schar ha'iskim b'Torah u'b'mitzvahs. How great, how grand is the reward, is the recompense of those who engage in the study of Torah and performance of mitzvahs. U'mashanogu lahazkir neshamot. And the fact that it is customary. But Joseph doesn't say, I'm suggesting this should be done. He mentions this as a matter of fact. It is customary to mention a Shemot. Bet Yosef lives in Israel. Shibboleh Haleket and Marzavitri are living in Europe. And yet, we have the Bet Yosef saying that which is customary to do in Israel. He never left Israel, the Bet Yosef. Ba'ad HaMeitim, on behalf of those who have passed on, Shayoya Lohem, that it should be effective for them. He says, Matzasi b'shem harab Reb Shneir, I found in the writings of a Rishon whose name was Rabbi Shneir, sheyesh bedrash kaper la'amcha Yisrael. It is possible that the Bet Yosef didn't see it in the Medrash Tanchuma. He saw it quoted by a Rishon named Rabbi Shneir, and he says that we can see that from the terminology of kapara, this is the mitzvah of the axed calf that we spoke about earlier, the unsolved murder, the Egla Arufa. He says we see Magid Shahamesim Tzichim Kapara, that those who have passed on also need atonement. And he says, the upshot is, Shefer Damim, when somebody would, heaven forfend, commit an act of murder, Choite, he sins. He brings about a damning and a damaging effect for all the Jewish people. Not only of his time, but all the way back through the generations, ad Yoitze Mitzrayim, to the generation that left Egypt. So they also need a kapara. And he says, this is why the Gemara in Masechet Kedushin says that a person, during the first 12 months after the passing of a parent, should mention the name of the parent and say, and this is the halacha, Harei ani kaparat mishkavo, I should be an atonement for him. The mitkaprim hametim bechaye gufim, because those who are living are able to actually achieve the concept of atonement. Those who are no longer living can achieve atonement through those who once lived. So let me recap here. We talked about this idea of Yizkor. We said it can be done privately. Doesn't seem to be an issue. Doesn't seem to be a problem. It's not a davar shebekdusha. We went back to the earlier sources. We saw Medrash Tanchuma. We saw Shibbolei Halakhic. We saw Machzer Vitri. Speaking about different elements, emphasizing the concept of tzedakah, and we have heard of Yizkor performed on Shabbat and on Yom Kippur, and the Machzer Vitri specifically saying that Yizkor has no place on Yom Tov. The Beit Yosef, in his commentary on the Tur, speaking of the widespread custom of mentioning the Shamot on Shabbat morning. Incidentally, we do perform this because we say something called Av HaRachamim. And Av HaRachamim is a prayer for the martyrs of Am Yisrael, but it is a form of mentioning holy Neshamot of the past. But that's all we do. At least in the world of Ashkenaz. In the world of Sepharad, very interestingly, some of them do perform the hashkava, or the mentioning of those who have passed on the Shabbat prior to the yahrzeit, which is fascinating because, as I will show you in a moment, when we go to the Shulchan Aruch written by Rabbeinu Yosef Karo, he in Shulchan Aruch mentions nothing about bringing to mind and verbalizing the names of those who have passed on Shabbat. Siman Reish Pei Daled. The Shulchan Aruch Rabbi Yosef Karo mentions nothing. However, the author of what would have been another Shulchan Aruch, written by Rabbeinu Moshe Isilish, who lived in Poland, who wrote a Shulchan Aruch alongside the Beit Yosef, never having met the Beit Yosef, heard of him, or knowing of his intentions, and the Beit Yosef never met the Ramah, as he is called, and never heard of his intentions. And at the same time, they both had the same holy idea, to write a code of Jewish law like a set table. And then the Beit Yosef's Shulchan Aruch appears in print. And incredibly, with tremendous humility, the Ramah says, if I print my work that I've labored on for decades, there'll be 2 Shulchan Aruchs. There'll be 2 codes of Jewish law. It will bring about disunity amongst the Jewish people. We've got enough of that now. Imagine we had 2 Shulchan Aruchs. And so he decided to simply amend the Shulchan Aruch by adding glosses. And he called his glosses the tablecloth. The Beit Yosef called his work the set table. He said, I'm adding a table. Some filigree. So interestingly, although we read from the Machzer Vitri, a disciple of Rashi, who rules out the idea of mentioning Shamot and Yom Tov and only talks about on Shabbat or Yom Kippur really, the Ramah is the one who says, and it's so fascinating to me because the Beit Yosef mentions this in his commentary, which is a forerunner of the Shulchan Aruch. But when it came to writing the Shulchan Aruch, the Beit Yosef leaves it out. The Ramah says in Siman Reish Pei Daled, chapter 284, subsection 7, V'nohagu lahazkir, it has become customary to mention Achar Kriyat HaTorah, after the reading of the Torah, Nishamot Hametim. He's quoting the Beit Yosef here. He says it's become customary to mention those who have passed on, the souls, on Shabbat. Ulevarech ha'oskim b'tzibur, and to bless those who are involved in the needs of the congregation. Tzorchei tzibur. Kol makom lefi minhago. Each place in accordance with its specific customs. And he references not the Beit Yosef, interestingly, but the Shibbolei Halakhic and the Mordechai, both of whom precede the Bet Yosef. Now the interesting thing is that in Sephardic communities, they follow the Ashkenazic ruling of the Ramah, and they perform Yizkor. And in Ashkenazic communities, we follow the Bet Yosef, we follow the Shulchan Aruch, and we don't mention the Shamot on Shabbat. But up until this point, you have seen, my dear friends, very clearly that the idea of mentioning the Shamot is linked to the holiness of the day of Shabbat. It has nothing to do with Yom Tov. It has nothing to do with the Shul. Going forward, in the Shulchan Aruch, what does it say on Yom Kippur? What does it say? Here the Bet Yosef does actually speak about the concept of saying Yizkor. Here, the author of the Mechaber of the Shulchan Aruch says, in chapter Tov Reish Chaf Aleph, Sivav, chapter 621 of Orach Chaim, which deals with laws of Yom Kippur, subsection 6, he says, V'nogu lidor tzedakah b'yom HaKippurim ba'ad hametim. It has become customary for us to give tzedakah. To give tzedakah, says the author of the Shulchan Aruch. He mentions nothing about verbalization of names of souls who have once lived. It is customary to give tzedakah on Yom Kippur ba'ad hametim. Comes the Ramah Rabbeinu Moshe Yisrael, and he says, Uma'azkir nishmoteham. We also mention their souls. The hametim gamkem yeshlem kapora on Yom Kippurim, because the dead also achieve atonement on Yom Kippur. So here we have the concept of Yizkor, which we do perform, on Yom Kippur, mentioned specifically by the Ramah. Bet Yosef, the Mechaber of the Shulchan Aruch, never mentions the idea in the actual syntax of halacha. Only in commentary on the Torah does he mentioning the Shamas. He never speaks about the verbalization of the souls of our fathers, our mothers, and our other beloved relatives, and our rebbes. He doesn't talk about that. Only the Ramah mentions it. The Shulchan Aruch says the emphasis here is on giving tzedakah. And the Shulchan Aruch says, Umazkirin. When we give the tzedakah, we also mention the names. Interestingly, when it comes to the chapter of Taf Tzadik 490, which deals with the laws of Pesach, there is absolutely nothing in the Shulchan Aruch. Yom Tov. Yom Tov. No mention in the Shulchan Aruch of Yizkor on Yom Tov, not from the Mechaber, not from Rabbeinu Yosef Karo, and not from the Ramah Rabbeinu Moshe Ishelin. Neither author of the Shulchan Aruch actually quotes the concept anywhere in halacha of reciting the notion of Yizkor on Yom Tov. This is wild, my friends. This custom that all Jewish people are following, it's not mentioned in the Medrash Tanchuma. Shabbat and Yom Kippur is mentioned there. It's not mentioned in the Shibbolei Halakhic. Shibbolei Halakhic speaks about Shabbat. Shibbolei Halakhic mentions the concept of atonement, of tzedakah. It's not mentioned in the Machzor Viti. In fact, the Machzor Viti necessarily rules out the possibility of Yizkor on Yom Tov. He only talks about Yom Kippur. In the commentary on the Torah, Bet Yosef mentions the idea of mentioning the Shemot on Shabbat, because it's a Yom Menucha, because it's a sacred day of serenity, which would have nothing to do with the Shul. And in Shulchan Aruch he mentions nothing, with the exception of Yom Kippur, which is very much in alignment with the words of the Machzor Vitri. He talks about the concept of giving tzedakah. And what we have is the Ramah, who mentions that the Neshama should be mentioned on Yom Kippur as well. Nowhere in the code of Jewish law is the concept of Yizkor ever even mentioned. Wow. I hope you still watch, because if you leave now, you will have the wrong idea. Now I'm going to introduce you to a very important halachic compilation by a great sage, a contemporary of the Ramah, the Shulchan Aruch, or living slightly later, Rabbeinu Mordechai Yaffe. All of his writings, and he had many, many fascinating writings, are all called Levushim garments. And he also wrote something called Levush Hachur. And the Levush Hachur, the purple or ermine garment, is on the Shulchan Aruch. And he follows the same order of the Tur, like the Shulchan Aruch did. And in Simin Tov Reish Chaf Aleph, which are the laws. Let's first go to Shabbat, as we did before. So in the laws of Shabbat, chapter 284, this is the same place that Bet Yosef made a comment on the Tur, but the Tur doesn't mention it. This is the same place the Ramah comments that we mentioned the Shamas, but the Bet Yosef, the Mechaber, doesn't mention the Shulchan Aruch. Says the Baal HaLevushim, the Bord Chayafa the Levush says, after the reading of the Torah, we say Yukum Prokon, and we bless those involved in communal matters. He says, Ein Zet China. This is not even a prayer. It's a bracha. It's a blessing. And then he says, V'nohagin lahazkir nishamot. It is customary on Shabbat. The Mordechai Yaffa was a posek in Ashkenaz, living in Poland. He says, it is customary to mention Neshamot, v'lomar av harachamim, to mention av harachamim. Now we do recite the prayer of harachamim prior to Ashrei. It's a memorial prayer for the martyrs of Am Yisrael. He says, v'amru, taima, what's the reason? Says the levush lefisha Shabbat yom menucha. Shabbat is a day of rest, dugma lati lavo. This should all be familiar to you because I showed you the sources that the Mordechai Yaffa uses. V'yom shegam hametim nochem bo. It's a day which is in the image of the future, and it's a day in which the dead also find respite. Ru'uya lahaskiram lemenucha u'levracha. You can discern the sources, where he's getting this from. And then he says, Ma shenagu lifsok tzedakah ba'ad hametim. The notion that we give tzedakah for those who have passed on. He says there is a smach. This practice is buttress from the Medrash, and he goes back to the Sifri and Parsha Shoftim, and he speaks about Kaper la'amcha Yisrael asher padisa, Yisrael elo achayim, asher padita elo hametim, the nation of Israel, those who are living, who you redeemed, those who have passed on. And he says Magid, this teaches us that they need kapara, and he says, so this kapara, that we are all responsible for each other, and reflecting the words of the Baal Turim, he says, Chol Yisrael nasu arevim ezel ezel, we're all responsible for each other. And he finishes off towards the end of Siman Reish Pei Daled, Umikan yotza haminhag, from here the custom comes, shenodim tzedakah ba'ad hamesim b'chapur ba'adam, that we make tzedakah, righteous commitments of generosity, of beneficence, for the benefit of the merit of those who have passed on. There you have it. It's not on the Shulchan Aruch, but it's in the Levush about Shabbat. Nothing about Yom Tov yet. Well, let's take a look and see what the Levush says when he discusses the concept of Yom Kippur. Very similar to what we've learned. He says, Umazkir Nishamot in chapter 621, Tov Reish Chof Aleph. In Siman Gimel, says the Levush, we mention Neshamas to remind ourselves, to remind of the merit of those who have passed on, and we give tzedakah for them, because they too need atonement, and their atonement comes not from mentioning names. The atonement comes from giving tzedakah. And he brings the same medrash that he brought earlier. And he says, and if you will wonder, Ma zechut yesh lo lamet shahachayim notnim litzdaka ba'avuram. How could you bring merit to somebody who's no longer alive? We are alive. We can make a choice, a decision of being generous or not. But somebody who's no longer alive, how can he get credit for something he didn't do? Yesh loma, perhaps, says the Levush, although the question is a very strong question. He says, perhaps, God who knows the truth, and God who remembers all the activities of those who have passed on. So God says, if this person would be alive, they surely would give tzedakah. And because they would do it, God considers it as if they had did it, and that becomes an additional merit for them. And he says, we see there's a biblical precedent for the notion of one who is alive obtaining pardon for one who's dead, as the Gemara in Masechet Sota on page 10, side B, describes the prayers of King David for his son Avshalom. And we also find this in the Gemara in Masechet Chagiga on page 15, side B, where the great Talmudic sage Rabbi Meir, sage of the Mishnah, prayed for one of his teachers who had gone astray, whose name was Elisha ben Avuya, referred to as Acher. And he says something interesting. He says, I want you to know that if they are righteous, then those souls will also pray for their descendants. As you pray for them, they will pray for you. But if you have a wicked ancestor, he says, don't even bother. That's what the Levush says. So far, we're talking about Yom Kippur. We have had no mention of Yizkor and Yom Tov whatsoever. However, my friends, if we go back to Siman Tov Tzadik, 490 of the Shulchan Aruch Haver Chaim, where there was no mention in the Shulchan Aruch, not by the Ramah or the Mechaber, we have the Levush telling us, and I quote, Ma shemaskir neshamot b'yom achron de Pesach. The reason that it's become customary to mention souls on the last day of Pesach. Why? It's not Shabbat, there's no respite. It's not Yom Kippur, there's no atonement. Why do we mention souls on the last day of Pesach? Clearly in the time of the Levush, this was a widespread practice. He doesn't say do this, he says that the reason that it is done. And that's because Mishum Shareitzin Lifsek Tzedakah, because it was customary to give tzedakah. Why was it customary to give tzedakah? Because this is the day we read Kol HaBechor. And this is where we mention Ish Kemat Nat Yadod. You should be familiar. Remember, Rabbi Simcha Vitri mentioned these very same ideas. Since we're giving tzedakah, so he says we gave tzedakah for the dead already. And because we're giving tzedakah for the dead, so he says then it's only worthy and meaningful that we should mention their names as well. In other words, the Levush says the essence of Yizkor is giving tzedakah. The mentioning of the name comes on the heels of the commitments to tzedakah. V'agav Yizkor asana imam letova b'zechutam. We ask Hashem that we should be remembered for good along in their merit. And he says, lekach, this is the reason maskira neshames b'chol ha'regalim. This is why all Yamim Tovim conclude with a mention of neshamot. Yom Kippurim we mention because it's Yom Hadin. Yom Kippur because it's Yom Hadin. But on all the festivals, it's because we just read in Shul, Kol HaBechor, and Kol HaBechor speaks about tzedakah. This is the first documented instance we have of Yizkor on Yom Tov. Now, in my research, I did come across contemporary articles that suggest that in the medieval times, it was customary for everybody to give tzedakah. This is when people made their commitments to the Shul. And as such, people aware and mindful of the notion of bringing merit to those who have passed on, despite what the Marzavitchi wrote, increasingly began to pledge tzedakah for those who had passed on as well. And since they were pledging tzedakah for those who had passed on, they would mention their names. That's the origin of Yizkor and Yom Tov. So the essence of Yizkor is tzedakah. The essence of Yizkor, the connection to the last day of Yom Tov, is absolutely Shul related. It's not because of the power, the profundity, the spiritual energy of the day. On Shabbat we learned it's because it's Yom Menucha. It's because it's a day of respite, a day of serenity. It's a day of rest for Neshamot also. We're not talking about Shabbat. On Yom Kippur it's a day of atonement. It's Kippurim. It's atonement for those who live and those who have passed on. Not talking about Yom Kippur. We're talking now about Yom Tov. Yom Tov, we mention the Shamot because we read in Shul, Kol HaBechor, and because this was a practice in Shul to give tzedakah, this has nothing to do with a private activity. It has nothing to do with what somebody did at home. If you were at home, you obviously weren't pledging tzedakah, or necessarily weren't pledging tzedakah, you didn't just listen to the Torah reading. The concept of Yizkor on Yom Tov has everything to do with the Shul. It is entirely Shul related. It's the rites and the ritual of the synagogue. Because this is what's read in the Shul, that's why we used to give tzedakah to those who were living. People began to give tzedakah for those who had passed on, and once they gave tzedakah, they began to mention the names as well. And this practice spread like wildfire, encouraged by the Gedolei Yisrael, the great, holy, and sacred leaders of the Jewish people, throughout Eastern Europe, pervading Western Europe. Eventually, it reaches the land of Israel. I found an article in which there's a quotation that Rabbi Avram, the son of Reb Shimon HaSofer, who was the chief rabbi in Krakow, the son of the Chatam Sofer, who rails against the practice of mentioning the Shamot in the land of Israel. He says they don't have a second day of Yom Tov. We should not be disturbing the serenity of Yom Tov. He says that's good for out of Israel. The 8th day of Yom Tov is a rabbinic holiday. That's where I can see, he says, veracity to mentioning the Shamot, value to giving tzedakah on their behalf. But in Israel? Now it's interesting to note that despite his remonstrations, that's not the halacha. And over his protests in the land of Israel, it has become customary. This is customary today throughout, really, the Jewish world. Sephardic Jews do Yizkor on a regular basis, on a weekly basis, like the Ramah. We are following, not even the Mechaber, the Bet Yosef, but we are following what developed as a result of the writings of Machzavitri, Shibbolei Haleket, and the Ramah, and the Mechaber with regard to the concept of Shabbat. This is how it evolved. So in other words, what we have now discovered is that the essence of Yizkor is about tzedakah. That's the foundation. The reason that this day became a tzedakah day was because of the Torah reading. Absolutely synagogue-centric. And that's why we ended up doing this on the last day of Yom Tov. And so, now let me introduce you to an 18th century Halakhic compilation on Torah reading and related practices in the synagogue. This is a synagogue handbook of halacha, written by the famous Rabbi Ephraim Zalman Margolis, who wrote many compilations. One of them called Sharei Ephraim, on the Torah reading and its related ritual. In Shar Yud, in Portal 10, in his subsection 31, he says, Ubiyom Kippur Mazkirim, we do mention the Shamot on Yom Kippur. And then he says, V'chein b'Yom Tov. Achron shel Pesach, which is where the Levush speaks about it. U'b'Yom Sheni de Shavuot, on the second day of Shavuot. U'b'Shmini Atzeret. Why not on Simchas Torah? Because on Simchas Torah we don't read Kol HaBechor. We read V'zot HaBrocha and Bereshit. Shekorin Bahem Kol HaBechor. It has nothing to do with the energy of the day and everything to do with the Torah reading in Shul. V'ksiv, and it's written there, Ish kematnat yadu, that everybody gives in accordance with what he's able to do. So here it's very, very clear that the concept of Yizkor as it developed was a result of the appeal made thrice annually in Shul because of the special Torah reading, Ish kematnat yadu, which evolved into a practice of people giving tzedakah to honor their loved ones who had passed on, which from there came the practice of mentioning the names in Shul. In Shul. Now I found, fascinatingly, in a sefer called Kav HaYashar, he asks, so what's the reason? What's the connection to Yom Tov, he says? And he says something fascinating. He says, this is because we know that there were 10 miracles that happened for the Jewish people in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple in Jerusalem, that happened thrice annually when the Jewish people would come to the Beit HaMikdash. Throngs and throngs, millions of Jews would come to a holy and a sacred compound that could never hold numbers like that. And yet it says they would stand sfufim, they would stand literally squashed, shoulder to shoulder, but when it came time on Yom Kippur to bow and prostrate themselves, when it came time in the festivals to prostrate themselves before Hashem, everybody had lots of room to be able to do so. And he says this happened, says the Kav HaYashar, on Chag HaMatzot, on Chag HaShavuot, and on Chag HaSukkot. He said, how did it happen? How did it happen? This is totally unnatural. The mass of humanity couldn't fit in that space. It couldn't be. He says something unbelievable. He says, Ki chol regel v'regel. Every Yom Tov. Every Yom Tov. Hoyu boyim nishmot Avraham, Yitzchak v'Yaakov. The holy souls of our patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, would come to the Beit HaMikdash. Beit HaMikdash Shel Maila, the heavenly temple, Im kol neshamot hatzadikim. Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov are going. You think they didn't take their wives? You think they didn't take all the righteous of the ages? Everybody makes a pilgrimage thrice annually to the Beit HaMikdash in heaven. And what would happen is HaMikdash shel mata halahaya mistalik. The earthly, terrestrial, physical Beit HaMikdash would dissipate, evaporate, and instead the holy Beit HaMikdash would take its place. The spiritual Beit HaMikdash would take its place. And he says the Migdash shel Maila, the heavenly Beit HaMikdash is spiritual. It's not limited to quantum physics. All of Israel could be together. He says, Achshav Shachorav Habayit, the Beit HaMikdash has been destroyed with our sins. It's so appropriate then for us to remember the names of our righteous ancestors, so that their merit might stand instead for us and for our progeny, for our children. Now really you can take this either way. Part of me reads this as it's very shul related, because every shul is a mini Beit HaMikdash. Part of me says, well, that's what used to happen when there was a Beit HaMikdash, so now every one of us, whoever we are, it was a time when heaven met earth. Every Yom Tov was a time when we were connected to the Neshamot, so we still continue to mention the Neshamot. It could very much be synagogue-centric, or read as related to the Beit HaKnesset, which is a minor expression or example or paradigm of the Beit HaMikdash. So ultimately, this is all about the notion of giving tzedakah and mentioning the Neshamot because of what was read in Shul. Let me share with you the words of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, the concise code of Jewish law in Simin Kuf Lamed Gimel, chapter 133, subsection 21, Gam b'yom achron shel Pesach u'v'yom sheni de Shavuot u'v'shmini atzeret, the last day of Pesach, the last day of second day of Shavuot, and the 8th day of what we call the festival of Sukkot. So maskirin neshamot. Why, says the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch? Lefi shekayim b'm kol ha'bachar. Because we just read in Shul kol ha'bachar, b'ksir sham ish kematnos yado. And therefore, they give tzedakah. The Kitzur Shulchan Aruch seems to be oblivious to the notion that people stopped giving for the living. He says, sure, people gave for the living. That was the custom. Maybe in Hungary it was still the custom at the time of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch in the 19th century. He says, V'kivan shenodim l'tzedakah, because they're already making commitments. So automatically, no, they made for the neshamot too. God should mention them. And they should mention us, which is basically the words of the Levush. So where does this all leave us? Well, here, in case you wanted more of a proof that this is synagogue related, let me share this with you. Sefer HaSichos, Book of Talks of Tafshin Hey, 1944, what was going on in the court of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, who had just escaped from war-torn Europe, snatched literally from the jaws of the lion. He has just arrived several years earlier in the United States, and here it says, Lahaskarat Neshamot, for the mentioning of Neshamot, there were 2 Sifrei Torah on the table, on the reading table. One was on the right of the Rebbe, and one was on the left. The Eis Haskarat Neshamot, at the time when they mentioned the souls, Ochaz and Yom Kippur, the Frierdiker Rebbe held be'etz chayim shel haSefer Torah shebiyamini. He held on to the roller, as it is in the Ashkenazic Torah scrolls, on his right. Sounds pretty shul related. That's Yom Kippur. In Likutei Sichos, Chelek Yud Daled, in the 14th volume of the Rebbe's edited talks, in the Hosafot, in the editions of Parshas Ekev, here the Rebbe is an excerpt of a letter the Rebbe authored on the 15th day of Kislev in the year 1949. And he says, you asked me about the notion of everybody saying Yizkor, getting an aliyah. He says, that would be impossible. We only have a limited number of aliyot. Aval, he says, Medaikim le'echos be'etz chayim, we do hold on to the handles of the Torah at the time of Yizkor. He says, V'chein osa chakmuch adash, and my father-in-law, the Rebbe, may he live and be well. The Rebbe is referring to his father-in-law, who is still terrestrially with him. does this practice. Now this sounds to be extremely synagogue related. However, it's not necessarily so, because I found a record of a conversation that unfolded at the Yom Tov table, Pesach, 1969. At the table, somebody asks the Rebbe, I don't know who this is, somebody asks the Rebbe, it is said that the Rebbes used to hold on to the rollers of the Torah during the recitation of Yizkor. What's that about? So the Rebbe says, it says, Eitz Chayim hi l'machazikim bo. The Torah is a tree of life for those who hold fast to it. He says, Chayim, life, is Hepech, the opposite of Yizkor, which speaks of death. And he says, therefore, tzarech liyas machazikim bo. Therefore, you have to hold on to it kipshute, and the Rebbe added that when we hold on to the rollers of the Torah, we should always do so holding our talus, not holding the roller directly. So, what I thought initially was a proof of its synagogue nature. I have to admit, I kind of retreated, because when I saw this conversation that the Rebbe had at the table, at the Yom Tov table on the last day of Pesach, 1969, it seems not to be shul related, but rather event related. We're mentioning Shamot. If a Torah is in front of you, grab onto it, because you hold on to the Torah, which is a source of life, and not the opposite. So what's the upshot? Where does this all leave us now? Yizkor in the age of COVID. So I think it is extremely important for all of us to know that the practice of Yizkor on Yom Tov is very much tethered to the synagogue, to the Shul, and to the Torah reading. Very much so. It's not because of the properties of the day, but because of what's going on in Shul. If I had any doubt about this, I listened to a tape of the Rebbe speaking on the 6th of Tishrei in 1982, Vav Tishrei Tov Shem Mem Gimel. A beautiful talk which has been transcribed. The Rebbe speaks with such passion and such fervor. And he speaks about the notion of Yom Kippur, the Achaz Bashana, and he speaks about how the child comes to Shul to be with his father and mother. He speaks about the idea of Yizkor with an entirely Shul-centric focus. It's very, very clear that the idea of Yizkor, the idea of being in Shul, are linked, conjoined, and ultimately one and the same. But where does this leave us? So as we began, the words of Yizkor themselves are actually not a davar shebekadusha. They're not a thing of holiness. They don't require a shul or a minyan. And so the conclusion that I come to is this. Yizkor should be in shul. The flippant attitude that I've seen from so many rabbis and so many articles, oh yeah, you'll do Yizkor by yourself, I think is misplaced, inappropriate, and may well serve to do damage in the future if chas v'shalom Mashiach tarries. And it lacks integrity. And it's not authentic. Because Yizkor and Yom Tov, as you have seen, is directly linked to the shul. Having said all of this, my dear brothers and sisters, we know and believe with perfect faith that Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu Ba B'Trunya. God does not make impossible demands of his children. And if this is how Minhag Yisrael Torah, if this is how the custom of the Jewish people evolved, this is the will of Hashem. What does Hashem want from us? We can't go to Shul this year. So there's value. You can say the words of Yizkor. The essence of Yizkor is really about tzedakah. That's abundantly clear. We should make serious commitments. Now is a time when people are worried about their finances. Now is a time we should give Hashem even more and place our trust in Him. Now is a time on Yom Tov, on the last day of Yom Tov, remember your father and your mother. Remember your grandparents. Think about the holy neshamas that have lived before us and the challenges they faced. And give. Give with an open heart. Ensure that Hashem's houses of worship and houses of Torah study and houses of kindness and communal activity continue to flourish as they must. And mention the names of your father and mother, because that'll be meaningful to Hashem this year. It'll be meaningful to those neshamas this year. It's the best we can do. But let's not get used to this. Because Yizkor really doesn't belong in our dining rooms or living rooms or studies. Yizkor. Yizkor belongs in Shul, where it always has been, ever since the practice has begun. And when we will say Yizkor with open hearts, when we will say Yizkor with full sincerity, but we will ask Hashem to look down at the merits of our ancestors and the efforts we're trying to make, we can hope and pray that this, my dear friends, will be the last Yizkor we ever have to think about. Because by the time the next Yom Tov rolls around, we will be with our Zaydis and Bubbies, our parents and extended family. We will be with our Rebbe in the third Beis HaMikdash. The Meira will be Ameinu. Amen.